Well, hello. Good morning, Betsy Berry. Good morning, whoever is on with us right now. We made it. We're together. This is a good thing. Good morning, Lisa. I got your questions. They will be, I'll do my best today to respond to them. For those of you who are tuning in, either live or watching the recording later on, if you are ever wanting to ask questions for this or, see if I'll respond to something that you were wondering about during my office hours, but you can't make it during the office hours, you can always shoot me an email, or if you'd like to give me some time to prepare. Lisa Grubbs threw some fastballs my way, so she gave me some time to prepare, which is fantastic. Thank you, friend. But before we get started, we made it. Whatever you got going on, whatever's going on in your life, however crazy it is, or however boring it is, or however tiring, or however crazy, boring, and tiring it is, whatever is going on, you got here now today. This is a good thing. So congratulations on being here, us being together. And okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about a number of things. First of all, I hope you had a great Memorial Day weekend. I don't know what that looks like for most of you. Most of us did not travel or go anywhere. So what did that mean? If you were working from home, did you just cease working from home? Or, and how did you commemorate those in our armed services, in our armed forces, who sacrificed themselves for us and for what they believed was the cause of liberty. And we took some time out yesterday, cooked, of course, but thought a little bit about my family members who've served, and I was grateful for that day. But today is Tuesday, and it feels like a Monday, and it's all very confusing, and days don't have any meaning anymore anyway, let's be honest. And then my kids are out of school, but they were already out of school, but now they're officially out of school. So it's summer, kind of, which you can tell because it's super hot in Cincinnati. So we're going to dig into some questions here. The goal simply of these office hours is to create a space where you can ask any questions you want, or and Lisa points out the walls are bare in my place. We repainted this room. We are listing my house for sale next week, and we're getting every room ready. So the walls are bare. We are going to put a painting back up on that wall. It should be back up today, but we had to paint this room yesterday. It's the last room to be painted. But the goal for our time together really is that we have where you have a space where you can talk to me, a religious professional, a clergy person, about questions you might have about your faith, about religion in general, about I don't know a lot about all the religions, but I know a couple of things about Christianity, and we can talk about those. And I try not just to answer, but to respond. So it's not, here's your question. Oh, you've got a question. Here's the answer. Now memorize it. You know everything better. Hopefully I have the capacity to respond rather than answer, and so you're heard, and we can talk through. And I think the questions that you all ask are questions that to which I can respond, but they take on, but you could then ask them again a year later or a day later, and the response might be a little bit different. So the thing about our faith lives is that it's not just question and answer. And the thing about our faith lives is that it's not just a simple equation. That there is a way that we engage that requires something of us every day, and it's something that is not solvable so much as it is livable. And I think that's the thing. All right, so I'm going to start with some questions. Lisa asks the question, can you explain the different priesthoods? She goes on, what is the Melchizedek priesthood? So you'll get this name Melchizedek priesthood in the Bible. She says, I'm familiar with it from Mormonism as a right for younger boys to begin holding the priesthood, a conferring of power Why is it mentioned so much in Hebrews? Well, Betsy Berry could probably answer this question better than I could, because she's an erstwhile attendee of our Bible study, and we spent 5 months in Hebrews, and then we spent, and we're in the middle of our Genesis Bible study right now. So we've looked at the character of Melchizedek shows up in Genesis. I think it's Genesis 13 or 14, but it's around there, and it is, and then later on he's mentioned in Hebrews. So I want to just talk a little bit about priesthood. First and foremost, when we talk about priesthood in the Old Testament, in the biblical concept of priesthood, the way we think about priests today, people like myself and other traditions that have priests, we think of clergy people who are, in many ways, there's a pastoral element. We are leaders, shepherds of congregations or gatherings, communities. And then we also administer this work of what we would call the sacraments, things like communion and baptism, right? Those are generally kind of the way we would kind of understand that. But there's so much emphasis in the priesthood currently, in your current context of priesthood, that would be pastoral, that would be about the way that we lead and care for the congregation. In ancient Israel, in biblical times, in the Old Testament, when you look at priesthood, the priesthood served the function of carrying out the rituals of the temple, first of the tabernacle in the wilderness, and then of the temple. They were the ones the priests were the ones who would carry out the sacrifices, the atoning sacrifices for the congregation, and of course, atonement is that word that means reconciliation. So the sacrifices on behalf of Israel that were meant to enact making our sacrifice that would help us make things, us hold up our part of the deal in our relationship with God, so to speak, right? So the priests in that context weren't at all inherently pastoral or having relationships with communities in that way. The priest's job was primarily and inherently sacrificial and ritual. So first of all, we want to get that in our heads. And when the priesthood is first defined in the Bible, you look, it starts with Aaron, Moses' brother, in the tribe of Levi. And so the priesthood it ends up being something that Levites do. If you're going to be a priest, you're going to be from the tribe of Levi. And then it doesn't mean that all Levites are priests, but all priests are Levites, right? So not all rectangles are squares, but all squares are rectangles, right? So not all Levites are priests, but all priests are Levites in that early biblical concept. So if you were going to be someone in Israel who was overseeing the work of the ritual sacrifice, whether it be in the tabernacle in the wilderness or in the temple in Jerusalem, you were going to be of that tribe. So you have that Levitical priesthood. Okay. So far so good. Okay. So, and that, again, that helps us. This is a side note. This gives you a little bit of a clue into the difference between priests in Catholic, Orthodox, and Anglican traditions and pastors in Protestant traditions, because priests administer the sacraments, and there is a sacrificial and ritualistic language that is inherent there. And then you think about the importance of the Eucharist, communion, Mass in the Anglican tradition, in the Roman Catholic tradition, and in the Orthodox tradition. And then you can start to kind of see how priests differentiate in that way. But we also very clearly in our current context take on very pastoral roles. And when you look at our ordination vows, there's all sorts of stuff about being pastors as well. So that's the deal. Side question, Lisa Grubbs, I'll get there. Why the sacrifices of animals all the time? We'll come to that. We'll come to that. So the priests, well, we can do that now, I suppose, because it'll help us understand Jesus. Priests sacrificed animals. And in general, historically, and you asked a question in one of your later questions about Cain and Abel versus, Cain and Abel and their different sacrifices. And Abel's sacrifice is an animal sacrifice and Cain's is not. There are also grain sacrifices. But animal sacrifice has, and when you look at the kinds of animals that are being sacrificed, it's important. We got to look past kind of the grotesqueness and kind of try to understand what's being sacrificed. The sacrifice that is being made in these rituals, and of course, in ancient tradition beyond Israel, animal sacrifice was not uncommon. So this is not a new idea. But we want to understand that it's not like a bloodthirsty God being filled with the blood of the creature and that fills him up. It's not a wrath thing. It's not an evil like punishment thing. It's not meant to be. It's a sacrificial element. Blood is sacrifice. You're sacrificing life. But you're not sacrificing your own life. You are giving something of yourself, though we want to understand that the animals that were being sacrificed traditionally would have been animals that belonged to the person involved, right? It became ritual. That ritual became sort of corporate in Israel, but that same idea that the animals would be. Remember, livestock is your property, is wealth. This is prior to them walking around with specific kinds of currency. This is prior to shekels and things like that and dollars, right? So we want to understand that to kill an animal is to sacrifice not only life, which is symbolic, that your blood would be involved in this covenant with God, right? But also that you would be sacrificing something of your own, that you would have less when this was over, that was actually a big part of the point, right? And so the sacrifice of the first fruits or the firstborn or the idea of it being the strongest or the mightiest or the best is the thing that you give to God, is an important element of this thing. And this sacrifice orients us in the kind of relationship that we have with God, which is to say, love that is sacrificial, right? All of our feelings about animal sacrifice aside, sacrificial love, a love that requires something of us. And if we would say it requires blood, you could take that again to mean some sort of weird sort of punishment or sort of angry God, bloodthirsty God thing. But that's not what I think is inherent at all when you read the scriptures. It is to give something of yourself, and to take a life should indicate the seriousness. And it wasn't like all the time. It's like you wake up in the morning and sacrifice a dove and move on, right? They were at very specific times and for very specific things. So when we read about animal sacrifice, we understand that they were at appointed times and for specific purposes, and not just sort of like, gosh, I've got to try to sell my house. I better go kill a dove and leave it out front. It's not like it's not transactional in that sense, right? Not in the purest sense. What the letter? Okay, so Melchizedek is a guy who shows up in Genesis. He's there for like 3 sentences. Okay, Melchizedek is a priest. It says of Salem. And which is a precursor to Jerusalem, but he doesn't say where this is prior to the Aaronite priesthood, the Levite priesthood. It's prior to Moses. Obviously, it's during Abraham's time, so it's prior to Israel. It's prior to the existence of Israel. So this priest shows up, and it says that Abraham gives him like a tenth of his spoils, like gives him a sacrificial offering. And Melchizedek blesses him, and that's it. Melchizedek disappears. So he's there, and he blesses Abraham, and then he disappears. Okay, that's the whole thing. Melchizedek, not a big deal. However, he's there, and there are a couple other instances of priests that show up before the Levite priesthood exists, right? So Moses marries, oh goodness, what was her name? Is it Jephthah? She has 2 different names, I think. But the Moses father-in-law is a priest in Midian. So that would be another kind of priesthood, right? Same idea. So priest is like a ritual sacrificial role in different traditions. Okay, got it. Okay, you bored yet? Is this like the driest I've ever been? We'll see. Hebrews is a letter in the New Testament written ostensibly to a group of people in the Jewish tradition who are now Christians. Okay. Now we call it the letter to the Hebrews. We don't know the author. We don't know the intended audience. We don't know the location. We know almost nothing about the context of the letter, but we know ish when it was written, right? So we know that it was probably written at the end of the 1st century. And we know that it was accepted as canon. Ostensibly, initially, it was put in with the letters of Paul, but it's not one of Paul's letters. If it is, it doesn't read like Paul. It doesn't connect like anything other than anything else that Paul has done. It's not his wording. It's not his style. It's not almost anything, but doesn't matter. It's in the Bible. Hebrews is called this because it is a letter that is written to a group of people who are Christian, and it is very, very laser focused on Jewish tradition, and it's writing to people who very clearly have a facility with Jewish tradition. They're not like me or you or many of our Gentile Christians today who are having to learn about ancient Judaism sort of secondhand. These are people who clearly, based on the way it's written, there's a lot that's assumed. If you were to pick up the letter to the Hebrews and we're reading through it, there's a lot you'd have to kind of like learn about Jewish tradition and symbolism and all that the 1st century Jew wouldn't have to learn about. They would know it. It would be assumed knowledge. There's a lot of that assumed knowledge in Hebrews that the author then builds upon to make the case for the messianic identity of Jesus, right? To make the case for Jesus as the Christ, and even to make the case for Jesus as Son of God, as divine agent of God's reconciliatory purposes. Okay, so this author does something really brilliant. He wants to connect Jesus to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He wants to connect Jesus to that God. And further, he wants to connect Jesus to that God in a unique way. He's really interested in the priesthood. And I think one of those reasons is, now this is likely after the temple has been destroyed and temple worship is they're trying to figure out, they're trying to understand, Jews are trying to understand, where does temple sacrifice come into play in our faith tradition? It's been so central to our understanding of ourselves, and now we can't do it. Imagine a group of Christians right now for whom it's been central to take communion, who can't currently do it. What kinds of questions we might ask, what kinds of things we'd be trying to understand about our faith, right? So you have that. You have these 1st century Jews who are not able to sacrifice. You also have them. The people to whom he's writing are now Christian, so they're trying to figure out how they've become Christian. They believe in Jesus, but they're trying to understand how this fits in with their Jewish faith and their understanding. Okay, so what? So hold on one second. Okay, so what they try to do, what the author tries to do, okay, in Hebrews, is he tries to connect Jesus to this Jewish reality, this Hebrew, specifically ancient Israelite understanding of God, and specifically wants to connect him to Moses, to this the way that the Jewish people identify themselves, which is this sacrificial act. He has this really interesting idea, which is that Jesus enacts a sacrifice that atones. Okay, cool. This is what the priest does. So the idea of Jesus as priest who enacts the ritual sacrifice that brings people back into reconciled, atoned relationship with God. Cool. Except Jesus isn't from the tribe of Levi. He's from David's lineage, right? Which is a different tribe. Okay, so he's got to figure out, which I think is Benjamin, right? Tribe of Benjamin, but not Levi. So this author is like, oh, Jesus is a priest. And you can imagine that people who know the priesthood really well are going to go, yeah, but Jesus doesn't come from the tribe of Levi. And so he's like, aha, yes, no, he doesn't. You're correct. He is a priest like Melchizedek is a priest. And so he does this really inventive sort of like midrash, this inventive sort of like take on what happens in Genesis, and basically takes this very minor character from Genesis narrative named Melchizedek and says, do you see, and who, by the way, was what the priest of Salem, which is the precursor for Jerusalem, which is where Jesus enacts his sacrifice, right? This idea that Melchizedek shows up from nowhere and goes to nowhere, which means he has no parentage and he has no beginning and he has no end. He connects that to Jesus. He does some really inventive work. If you're looking for this to be a scientific proof, you would be very disappointed in the author. But from a poetic standpoint, it's very powerful. From a symbolic standpoint, it's a very powerful thing. What he does is he says, we know there are other priests. There's a priest like Melchizedek, not a Levite, who predates Levi, who predates Moses, who predates the covenant as we understand it, who predates the tabernacle as we understand it. Jesus is a priest like that. And so what he does is he tries to place Jesus into the minds of those people who are hearing this letter as the supreme example of priesthood that supersedes that word. Supersessionism is used really negatively in Hebrew, so I want to be careful with that. But that is larger than, and if anything, doesn't negate the Levitical priesthood. I want to say this, doesn't negate Levitical priesthood, doesn't negate the work that's been done in Israel throughout the generations. But the argument that the author makes is that the kind of priesthood into which Jesus is working, this Melchizedek priesthood, is a priesthood that is the sort of the template for all priesthood. So he actually uses this language where Jesus is the sort of, if you imagine that God is the sun, the Father is the sun, like S-U-N, like the bright light, right, at the center of the universe, shining down. Imagine Jesus standing in front of that sun. The shadow that's cast is what he calls the tabernacle, which is the place where God dwells in Israel before the temple. This idea of Jesus casting this shadow, but a shadow doesn't mean that it's darkness, right? Because you can still see the sun, but if you look down at a shadow, you can see the form of something. So he starts to see the work that's being done in Israel as a precursor to Jesus, and Jesus has laid out what that precursor would look like. This is crazy stuff. This is heavy stuff. If you're not getting all this, I totally get it. It's really like kind of, there's a lot. We spent 5 months on it, and I'm trying to boil it down to 10 minutes, right? But the idea is that Jesus is a priest like Melchizedek, having no beginning and no end, okay? Greater than Abraham, because Abraham pays him tribute. And who is Abraham? The father of the Israelites. But not in a way that negates Israel, not in a way that is meant to supersede the work of the Jews or to negate the work of Israel at all, even a little bit. What he's trying to suggest to those Jews who have become Christian in that first century time is that all that they have understood and all that they have learned in their faith has prepared them to understand the reality of what God is doing in Jesus, and to recognize that the power of what Jesus is doing is larger than anything they've ever seen before. This is the climax of all priesthood. It puts an end essentially to sacrifice. This one sacrifice is made so that no other sacrifices, the way that they were being made, need to be made, right? There, it goes on, and I could talk for the whole thing just about Hebrews, and I think it might be like your least favorite office hours I've ever done if I did that. Hebrews also creates, he does this really interesting thing, the author, both in terms of making Jesus the priest, but also making Jesus the sacrifice. So Jesus acts as both priest and sacrifice. I don't know a lot about the Mormon tradition. I do know that in the Mormon tradition, Jesus is, the Mormons aren't Trinitarians, so they don't believe in Father, Son, Holy Spirit the same way that Orthodox and creedal Christians do. And so Jesus is a son of God, not the son of God, but a son of God. And so this Melchizedekian priesthood, they see us as being able to live into, and we can be that too. Mormon doctrine, as far as I've understood it, holds that Jesus becomes deified, is able to become God, and so can you, so can we, so can humans. I think men only. I could be wrong about that. That we can become gods, and so Jesus' priesthood, to live into that priesthood, is the beginning of that taking of that step towards our own deifying, self-deification over time, over, I guess, more than one lifetime, even, I guess. Christianity is different. Creedal and Orthodox Christianity, like the Episcopal Church, the Roman Catholic Church, Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox, is going to look very different. We hold that this thing that Jesus did, Jesus invites us into, but Jesus still remains unique. We can't become Jesus. We can't become, we become sons and daughters of God, adopted into this reality and becoming embodied in some way as the mystical body of Christ on earth, doing this work, but not in a way that someday we will become gods of something else, gods of our own planets or gods of anything else. Like, it's a different understanding of that priesthood. So that's the most that I can say about how Mormonism involves itself with that. I'm not really sure, but the idea in Christianity of Jesus as a priest in the order of Melchizedek is it creates a scenario in which Jesus' priesthood is not limited to time or space, is not limited to one particular moment. Okay. And is sort of a template or a lens through which we can understand all priesthood. Okay. All right. Here we go. More easy questions from Lisa. Oh my goodness. Cain and Abel. I'm going to read the whole thing and then we'll see what happens. But you asked this question. It goes like this. Cain and Abel. In the story, Cain offers to God the best fruits of his labor as a farmer. Abel offers sacrifice of meat and animals. Why does God prefer Abel's offering? It seems that both offer the best that they could. Why does God not love both offerings? If we are all made in God's own image and God has ultimate control and will over the universe, why are we surprised when Adam and Eve disobey? See, now this is a separate question, but I'll keep going. When Cain can't control his anger, even Judas, he had his own unique role in our salvation. What if Judas had not betrayed Jesus? Did God have a plan B to bring us all together? The God of the OT is so frequently angry, destroying everyone except Noah and his kin, and then having regrets, anger followed by sorrow and remorse, very human-like. Okay, there's a lot going on there. Let's start with Cain and Abel. Okay, let's start with Cain and Abel. There's a lot of people who have tried to say, like, oh, well, it's obvious that God liked Abel's offering better than Cain's because Abel's was a blood offering and Cain's was a grain offering. And some people have used this to sort of say this was the people of Israel or the ancient tribes that became Israel sort of picking the hunter-gatherer over the farmer. I don't buy it, but also I think it's irrelevant. I think it's actually irrelevant. I think asking those questions is interesting from a contextual standpoint to try to understand sort of different historical tensions that are at play in different communities. But overall, the reality that we have to accept in order to deal with this story, you don't have to like it, but what you want to understand is this is not a story about God liking animal sacrifice over grain sacrifice. This is a story about what you do when God likes something this better than this, and when you don't understand why. You don't get to know why. If you don't get to know why someone chooses something, but you still have choices to make after the fact, Cain and Abel is a story about that. Cain and Abel is a story about when God makes a decision that you don't like or understand, how will you respond to that decision of God's? That's what Cain and Abel is actually about. It's about, like, God makes a choice, which, by the way, God is not in the Hebrew Bible and in the Christian, in either the Jewish or the Christian tradition. God is not just a concept or a blank sort of page that we can write whatever we want onto it. God is God's own sovereign self with God's own agency and being, divine being. And the reason that's important is we don't always get to know why God does, thinks, acts the way God does, think, or act, speak, anything. We don't always get to know. And this is really frustrating for us. We want to know. What I love about the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and you brought up Cain and Abel, you brought up Adam and Eve, and you brought up Noah, all from the first 11 chapters, which are known as the primordial or primeval history in Genesis. What I love about these stories is that they are really foundational. They are asking really foundational questions, the first questions about how we understand ourselves in our relationship to God. Some of the first stuff that helps us understand who God is in the Jewish and then Christian tradition, and how we are able to, how we come out of that. What does it mean about us, right? So here's the deal. Cain and Abel both sacrificed something to God. God considers one of them acceptable and one of them not. And we don't find out why. Okay, so then what? What happens next in the story? In the story, God goes to visit Cain. In fact, the good news about this story is it's so brief that I can read it to you and waste zero time. Now the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have produced a man with the help of the Lord. Next she bore his brother Abel. Now, Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel, for his part, brought of the firstlings of his flock their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering, God had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. The Lord said to Cain, why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. Cain said to his brother Abel, let us go out into the field. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. When the Lord said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, what have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Today you have driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and anyone who meets me may kill me. Then the Lord said to him, not so. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance. And the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who came upon him would kill him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod. That word Nod means wandering, east of Eden. That's the whole story. Notice in the story that for whatever reason, we don't know why God rejects Cain's offering, but we know that God then immediately goes to Cain and says basically like, hey, this is not the end of the world. You screwed up. We don't know why he screwed up, Lisa, or anyone else who's listening. We don't know why. But we have the story. We got to work within the confines of the narrative if we're going to do honest work. We don't get to just decide, well, God sounds like a jerk. I mean, I guess you could think that, but the point is God makes a decision here. We don't get to know why, but we know that God has decided one is acceptable and one isn't. But he goes to the one who gives the unacceptable offering and says, and this language is really important because it says that his face is fallen, which means he's looking down. And there's this language of looking that's really important, especially in our Old Testament. The face of God, when God shines God's face upon you, that's the definition of blessing. To be looked upon by God is blessing. Looking away is a sign of rejection. So when Cain's face falls, it is a looking away from God. It is a downward cast that is not just about being sad and down in the dumps. It is actually about his moving away from looking towards God. My offering didn't work, so I'm just not going to look that way. Now, okay, but God goes to him and says, this does not have to be the way that it is. It doesn't have to be this way. You have the capacity to do this right, God says. It doesn't record any response from Cain. The very next thing we hear from Cain is that he takes his brother out and kills him. So the story is it's not about why God chooses what God chooses. It's about how we respond to God when God makes a choice we don't like or understand. And then, notice, Cain kills Abel. Then he lies about it. Then God punishes him, but that punishment is not death. And in fact, Cain complains, you've given me too great a punishment. People are going to kill me. And God even says, no, I won't let them kill you, actually. You get to live. But Cain, who is a tiller of the ground, doesn't get to till the ground anymore, and he becomes a nomad and a wanderer. Okay? This is really fascinating. The story has always fascinated me. Cain is a character from the beginning who misunderstands God. And so the reality is that Cain's misunderstanding God is like he doesn't know how to make a real sacrifice to God. When God comes to him and says, it doesn't have to be like this, you're capable of better than this. You can go, well, he should, well, I don't know. What was wrong with his offering in the first place? I don't know. What I know is God knows, and Cain doesn't ask. There's nowhere he goes, how can I make it better? There's no interaction with God on Cain's part. Cain's response to God when God visits him, which is a merciful act. Hey, your offering to me sucked, but let's talk about it. And Cain, instead of trying to figure out how to make it better, make it right with God, turns around and kills his brother out of enmity and jealousy. And so we want to understand how this story talks about our shame when we are rejected or something about us is rejected, because he's not rejected. Notice this. Cain is not rejected. His offering is. God goes to Cain to follow up, which is a relational behavior. It's a relationship that God has and is seeking to further and continue with Cain. Cain's refusal of that relationship, likely based in shame and guilt, but also for reasons we're not totally sure of, is really the heart of this story in a lot of ways, but also God's mercy. We have to be careful when we read these stories, especially the first stories from Genesis 1 through 11, I would say to read them seriously. That if we're going to wrestle with the God that is presented in these stories, that we take the stories as they are. And one thing that we need to do then is treat them as literature and not as textbooks. If you read this as a textbook of historical, if you're trying to understand the historical nature of this story, I think that actually becomes, I think it gets in the way of you hearing the story. I think if you're spending time, if we're trying to understand, well, what did Cain exactly do? What was the difference between this offerings and da-da-da-da? Like, dude, here's the story, right? It's like if I'm like, a man walks into a bar and you're like, well, what kind of bar was it? Like, or like, a priest and a rabbi and a priest and a rabbi and a pastor walk into a bar. And then someone's like, what were they doing there? Why were they together? It's like, I get that those questions can be asked, but also what's the joke? What's the story? So I'm not trying to discourage the questions because I think these questions are really important. What I'm suggesting is you and I, most of us, have been raised in a version of Christianity where we are looking for the historicity of these stories and trying to understand. And what we're really scared of is, will this happen to me? Am I going to be rejected by God? And for arbitrary reasons I don't understand and end up like Cain. And the reality is kind of in the sense that you might do something God doesn't like, and you might think you're doing okay, and you still might not do a great job at something. The question then is, how will you respond in that space? What does spiritual and emotional resilience look like? And notice in the story how God intervenes to hopefully build up that resilience and to continue to give Cain opportunities to learn and to live, right? But we get hung up on some of the things that kind of we're worried that somehow because God is mysterious, and mysterious is too nice a word for what God is. It's too nice. Because God is inscrutable, because you don't get to understand, and neither do I, and we're frustrated by that. And I say we because I get frustrated by it very much so as well, very much so. because we get frustrated by our inability to understand God and God's purposes and God's actions. We then think that God is arbitrary. And I think that God can seem arbitrary. But I think that takes us down a dangerous path of disenfranchisement, or that's not the right word, disillusionment and disruption in our connection to God. The primary reality of your life is your relationship to your Maker. That's the primary truth of your whole existence, of all existence. Our relationship to the one who made us is the primary truth of our lives. What gets in the way of that? Right? Shame, guilt, sometimes our own ignorance. What we have in this story is an example of a God who doesn't pretend that your crappy offering is good, but also comes to you and says, okay, so we can work with this. Like, this doesn't have to stop us. But we also have in the story is the human capacity to reject God when we don't understand why God is doing what God is doing. And what we see in this story is it leads Cain to not only to a disruption of his connection to God, but a dehumanization of his brother. Literally. Who is his brother but an obstacle to be killed and then lied about? So this story is really important because it's about us. God. Now let's talk about Adam and Eve. Hopefully that's somewhat helpful. Why are we surprised when Adam and Eve disobey? I don't know. I don't think Episcopalians are surprised that Adam and Eve disobey. I think as Episcopalians are like, well, of course we did. Like, God told us not to do something. We're totally going to try that. That sounds like the most Episcopal thing. Don't you tell me not to do that is like the most Episcopal mindset possible. So I don't know that we're surprised. There is this question that gets brought up as we read the story of the first man and woman in the garden. And this idea that God sets us up for failure. And again, I just want to call attention to how skeptical all of us are capable of being of God and God's purposes and motives. The God that is described in our scriptures desires a relationship of trust with us. And that trust feels tenuous for us at best so often. My favorite response to Jesus in the scriptures, one of my favorites is the one where he tells the guy, he tells the guy, if you have faith, anything can happen. Or if you have faith, you can be healed. And the guy goes, Lord, I believe, help me with my disbelief, which is to say, I totally believe. And also I kind of don't. And I think this is one of the best, most honest responses that faithful people have. God says, I want a relationship of trust with you. And we say, I trust you, but in the story of Adam and Eve in the garden is a story about the disruption of trust from the very beginning. We want to remember that we tell the story as if they walk around again. So let's stick. Oh, look what I just did. Let's stick to the narrative, friends, the actual story we have. We try to we act like the story is that God said, you can do whatever you want, except don't touch that tree ever, ever, ever. And then they were like, well, now I have to touch the tree. That's not the story. In the story, a serpent shows up and you can go like, well, this is ridiculous. Fine, it's ridiculous. It's the story. Deal with the story we have, not the story we want. And in the story we have, the serpent shows up and says, okay, to Eve, well, what did God really say about that tree? Well, she said we couldn't eat it. In fact, we shouldn't even be looking at it or being anywhere near it. And the serpent goes, I don't think that's true. What is the serpent doing? The serpent is introducing not just doubt into the relationship, but but insecurity. And Walter Brueggemann writes about this in his Genesis commentary. He does phenomenal work on this. He does phenomenal work, period, right? The guy's great. But he does phenomenal work in his understanding of the relationship between humanity and God here, because he talks about the introduction of insecurity, that in God, in this relationship, this relationship is sufficient. We have what we need. We are being cared for and loved. The story of the man and woman in the garden is of a people who are taken care of, who have an intimate relationship with God, and who are being looked after. And the serpent introduces, this is not about a tree that looks so good they finally want it. No. It's about an outside force. That's the important element of the serpent. The serpent is not a person. The serpent is not God. The serpent is not our psyche. Okay? Freud didn't write this. Okay? In the story, an external force that is not us introduces skepticism of God into our consciousness. And what Brueggemann suggests, which is so awesome, is I think he even calls the serpent the first theologian. Because before the serpent, Adam and Eve just talked to God. But the serpent doesn't encourage them to talk to God. The serpent talks about God. And gets them to think things about God that are contrary to their experience in their relationship with God. He uses the thinking about God to distance them from the actual experience of God. We will think about us. We will so often think about God rather than try to experience God. We will so often intellectualize God rather than try to interact one-on-one with God, right? This is what the serpent does. The serpent says, I wonder if God really has your best interests at heart. I don't know about that. I don't know about that. This is important because we are reading the story as if God has set us up for failure. But that story is about what happens when things disrupt our connection and make us second guess the fact that God is there for us. God is for you. And so what the serpent does is the serpent seeks to undermine that in this story. Undermine the belief, the human's belief that God is there for them. Oof. This is painful stuff, right? So I want us to understand, like, there's still questions to be had. Why did God create that serpent? Why did God do that? Why did God, create any of these things? Those are bigger questions that we can ask, and they're worthy questions. They're worth our time. But what? But the main idea here that's being expressed in the story of Adam and Eve and the serpent in the trees is that God has set people up in a relationship of trust. And we are meant to believe that we are cared for. We are meant to dwell secure in the truth of that. And then there are things that are not just within us, external realities that invite skepticism, insecurity, and disbelief into the conversation. So I want us to think about that a little bit. like how we understand these stories is oftentimes informed, um, well, by poor teaching when we were growing up. If you were told the stories of Cain and Abel and Adam and Eve by moralistic people who believed that the point was to teach you a lesson, and also that they were historical fact, and the primary thing is to believe that they happened rather than to dig into the story and understand what this tells us about God and how we experience God, then we end up with a lot of we come at these stories with a lot of baggage, myself included, right? Noah. Well, I could spend 5 weeks on Noah, and I've got 10 minutes left. The story of Noah is a story about a humanity that is completely corrupted. Pardon me, evil. It's the question, what if everyone was evil in the whole world? What would God do? It's a story about, and we've got to accept that, the story. You don't have to believe it's true now, but the story goes that everyone but Moses is evil. That's how everyone. Listen. Actually, the language is so strong here. The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out from the earth human beings I have created, people together with animals and creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord. Hard for people to understand this story as a story of mercy, because God chooses to spare humanity through one family. There's a lot I could say about Noah. There are a lot of my colleagues who think that God made a mistake, and that he like sort of like feels like he shouldn't have done what he did. And so I don't believe God makes mistakes, period. Like, doesn't fit within my understanding, because the definition of, like, how do you define mistake? Who's defining that? Who sets the boundaries for what's right behavior and wrong behavior? This is an early climax in the drama between God and humanity, the Noah story, the flood epic. And there were many flood epics in the ancient Near East because there was likely a very large flood, and different traditions sought to understand that through the lens of their faith lives, through the lens of their religious understanding of the divine. And the Jewish tradition was one that did that. So I'd rather do like a 6-week course on Noah. None of it would necessarily make you like God more. I can't do that. I can't decide whether or not this will make us think God is better or worse. But I'm interested in what I'm interested in what we learn about humanity, about what it means about our capacity for evil. And I'm interested in, like, why we think that there are no consequences for our actions. That God loving us and forgiving us means there are no consequences. I don't get that forgiveness of the way we are somehow means that we shouldn't experience any of the repercussions of our behavior. So if God forgives us for abusing the earth, does that mean that global warming won't happen? How does that, like, you see what I'm saying? Like, we got a part to play in the reconciliation process. So forgiveness is a process. And I was reading today in morning prayer, the appointed texts were Psalms 97 and 99. Is that right? And in 97, it actually has this line, or is it in 99? Yeah. In Psalm 99, verse 8, O Lord our God, you answered them indeed. He's talking about when the priests called out to God, to those who call upon God's name. O Lord our God, you answered them indeed. You were a God who forgave them, yet punished them for their evil deeds. Forgave them, yet punished them for their evil deeds. So we have this idea that forgiveness means there's no punishment, and that punishment means there's no forgiveness, which explains a lot about the way that we live our lives right now in modern day America, isn't it? What if consequences and forgiveness live side by side in the heart of God, and that one does not undermine the other? Forgiveness means that I will do what needs to be done. If I'm the forgiver, I will do whatever I can on my end to make sure that our relationship continues and that it is not ended. I will do what I can to make things right. Forgiveness is getting out of the way the things that keep us from being in right relationship. Okay? So God can offer us forgiveness, but we still have to experience, or we still end up experiencing the consequences. So what's happening in that first flood story is that the people of Israel are telling their version of a flood that occurred, probably, and that their understanding is the flood as a response. They're trying to explain something about the consequences of evil. That the evil work of humanity, when people are evil, it grieves God. It's not abstract. When you hate your neighbor, that is not abstract. Let me put it this way. It's not that if you break rules, you go to hell because you broke certain rules and hell is the punishment. That's garbage theology, although it's the theology most of us were raised with in some way, shape, or form. Heaven is your reward for doing right, and hell is your punishment for doing wrong, is what we've been taught. But the idea is, if you hate your neighbor, you're in hell, and you live a hellish life. And it grieves God. If you think you can hate your neighbor and love God, you don't understand God. If you think that you can live a life that is dehumanizing of others, that is evil and destructive and anti-Christ, anti-love, anti-justice, and that won't piss God off, that God will just accept that as a part of you because you've got, you make mistakes too, and that God's responsibility as a loving God is to just sort of like turn away and not pay attention to it. This is a problem that we have in our understanding of it's a narrowness, a shallowness in our understanding of justice and our understanding of love, right? So the forgiveness of God is what God does so that we can continue in relationship with God, even when we do evil things. Not just when we make mistakes, like, oh, I shouldn't have said that thing to my wife, or like, oh gosh, like I was kind of grouchy the other day, or I cut someone off in traffic, or even I made a mistake, I made a bad call on something, and not just that, or even like I said something I shouldn't. I was mean, I was cruel, but like that we think God's love for us means that has no effect on us or our relationship with God, I think is a patent misunderstanding of how love works in real time. The forgiveness of God means I'm not giving up on you. We keep working on this relationship. But imagine if you choose never to accept that forgiveness and never to acknowledge the evil that you do. Do you think that will have no effect, no adverse effect on God's creation, on your own heart, on your own soul, and on your relationship with the God who made you? Noah is a difficult, painful story. The flood story. It's brutal. And some would think it's God going too far. Others are scared that God will do it again. Again, we're trying to figure out if God is arbitrary and therefore this could just happen because God's feeling like it. You mentioned, Lisa, that God can be angry in the Old Testament. Well, Jesus is God in the New Testament, and Jesus gets angry in the New Testament. The anger on display from God is always only in response to evil, to abuse of power, to injustice. The anger of God is never arbitrary. Not in our scriptures. What's sad is we don't like to see what God gets angry about. God doesn't get angry because you cuss too much, or because you aren't perfect in your definition of that, flawless. The anger that we see God having is at people who abuse the power and authority they've been given to harm others and to create something for themselves at the expense of others. The anger we see, the wrath we see enacted and embodied in God comes when people reject relationship with love and choose themselves over their community. The anger that we see that God has is an anger towards evil. And what is evil? Evil is that which seeks to corrupt and destroy the creatures of God. That's from our catechism. Evil is that which seeks to corrupt and destroy God's creation. When we attach ourselves to destruction and annihilation, when we attach ourselves to greed, self-righteousness, and self-aggrandizement over the love of neighbor and the care for one another, we cannot think that God just goes, oh, I don't care, no big deal. What did I say to begin this? Your relationship with the one who made you is the foundational truth of your life. I get that we're scared of making God angry. I get that we have a patriarchal understanding of God, that God is a man with a white beard and a frown who gets mad at us and punishes us when we're bad. I promise you, I don't believe this is the God of Jesus Christ. And I don't believe it is the way that God is really truly expressed and meant to be expressed in the Christian faith. But we have a lot of deconstructing and reconstructing to do, to dismiss ourselves and disabuse ourselves of this patriarchal God, this punishing, angry, human, sort of petty God. And I think I don't think we have to leave our scriptures alone to do that. I'm interested in what the anger of God tells us. By the way, the anger of God never actually gets in the way of God fully holding on to humanity. And there is always a way forward that is offered to humanity. God's creation is always given a path forward to live more fully and to love. I think this is something we can understand about forgiveness. I've gone over my time. Lisa, you asked another question, and Kathy Baggett, you asked a question. Kathy asked a question about the existence of evil and how I think it got here and all that. Woof. And Lisa asked me a question about what I did with my time before I lived in my house all the time and didn't go anywhere. I'll answer that briefly. I spent a lot more time with one-on-one meetings with people, Lisa. I remember you and I went out for coffee once. I used to go out to coffee with people. I used to go out to lunch with people. So much of my job is those interpersonal relationships, and they're really suffering right now, and it's painful. But I also was, running a staff that was facilitating a building that was a gathering place for hundreds of people, thousands of people. And so we're not gathering people in person that way right now. And so some of the reason for us to get together isn't there, but we continue to seek to serve all the people in our church and in our community. And so a lot of my work is done sitting in front of a computer right now, and I'm having a lot of meetings, and writing a lot. I'm writing a lot, and I'm trying to preach and write a lot. I believe that those are helpful ways for me to stay in connection with my folks, with you all, whom I love. But so much of my work is in person, has been. And that has been a really big transition and not one that I enjoy. I very much look forward to the time when we can all be, I always say when we can all be back together, and I mean it, but also when I can be making trips to have coffee with people, to have meals with people, to connect with people in that way. It's such an integral part of the way that I understand my life with you. Unlike the Levitical priests, my priesthood is very relational and is meant to be. Which is why I like even sitting here and talking ostensibly to a computer screen, knowing that there's a couple people out there that are paying attention to that. Hopefully it's a couple people that, this is us connecting in a strange way. But hopefully if I'm able to be here and give you a little bit of my time and my heart and myself, that creates another space of connection and love and relationship. Kathy, I'll address your question about evil later. Lisa, your questions were fantastic. Others, please do send in questions. If you're watching this live, thank you for being with us. If you're watching this recorded, thank you for joining. I hope you'll be with us next time. And if you have questions you'd like me to answer, to respond to, you can always hit me up on Facebook, send me a message or email me, and then we'll see you next week. Lisa, thank you so much for your time. Betsy, thank you so much. You know that I love you both. For all who also are joining us, thank you. I hope you have a wonderful week. And I look forward to us doing this again. Same bat time, same bat channel next week, 11 a.m. Eastern on YouTube Live. All right, my friends, take care now, okay?